President seems to have a big issue with this. Of course, we first learned about this from Jim Comey, who takes notes after he has meetings with took notes after he had meetings with Donald Trump. Yesterday, the president tweeting about all these note-taking people around him.
Trump doesn't want his wrongdoing documented. That's why he doesn't send emails. We know, and we all heard with our own ears, the undercover recording that Michael Cohen made of Donald Trump talking about paying off, playmates and porn stars. He wants all of his wrongdoing kept, in the dark. And it was interesting. I think it was Corey Lewandowski who was the one person that he said, hey, I want you to take this down. And then he gave him these crazy instructions. I want you to tell Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself. And then I want you to tell him don't look at past possible collusion or conspiracy. Only look at future crimes, which doesn't make any sense. As prosecutors, I can say, rarely do we sit down and try to investigate crimes that haven't been committed yet. The Minority Report, exactly. So, the whole notion that Trump is afraid to have what he says and does documented, I think it tells us everything about his intent and what's actually going on.
I think it's interesting if you look at Don McGahn as the leader of this group of the 12 or 13 who refused to execute the president's criminal orders. Don McGahn is a D.C. institutionalist. His wife is. The defining aspect of this presidency is that it has been staffed by people who are not really of this world, this D.C. Beltway universe. Therefore, they owe their existence to Donald Trump. Right. Don McGahn is not that guy.
Right.
And that's why.
But Don McGahn is part of that group that Donald Trump would have called the swamp.
Oh, absolutely. And you know who is not? Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, these kind of island of misfit toys individuals that are inhabiting this White House. And therefore, they do what the president says. They execute his nefarious missions because they know that they owe their existence to him. Don McGahn says, you know what? I was here before you. I'm going to be here after you. And I have to protect my interests in this town and in this ecosystem that I inhabit. And that's why I find that to be really a defining characteristic of why he's the guy who can kind of speak out and say everything that happened. Because he has to protect himself in this world long after Donald Trump.
Natasha.
Relatedly, we saw a lot of leaks about Don McGahn earlier this year and throughout the last year. And those leaks made him look good. And I think that was kind of, that attested to the idea that either he or people around him were trying to protect his reputation as someone with integrity, as someone who was trying to stop the president's worst impulses. But we knew a lot of what the Mueller report said about Don McGahn before it actually came out. And we knew that Don McGahn was talking to investigators freely and extensively.
Right.
The White House did not seem to anticipate that. One of the more interesting episodes, I think, related to this has to do with Katie McFarland, who was Michael Flynn's deputy. The president apparently asked her to write an internal memo saying that the president had not directed Michael Flynn to discuss sanctions with the former Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak. And she didn't do that because she didn't know whether that was true. And I think that that's another thing that stops a lot of his aides from carrying out his orders, is that they don't know what's true or false, and they don't want their names attached to this. Similarly, people in the White House, spokespeople, communications people, they won't attach their names to statements because they don't know, A, whether what the president is asking them to do is true, and B, whether or not he's just going to come right out and undermine it 5 minutes later in a tweet. So I think this is obviously a pattern that Don McGahn, in a place that Don McGahn did not want to be associated with forever.
Interesting point, though, because some of these people who didn't do things because they didn't know them to be true, that's different from not lying for the president because you're trying to protect yourself. It's literally I don't know this to be true. And there was a piece in the report about Sarah Sanders, who was found to have said something to reporters that was not true. Katie McFarland as well talked to the Washington Post and said things that she knew not to be true. So to the extent that it's not clear where these lines are. Some people drew certain lines to say I'm not lying for the president. Some drew lines that said I'm not committing crimes for the president. And others absolutely did get involved in the mix.
Well, for those who have said this is a lot like Fire and Fury, but with more footnotes and better documented, people spoke to the counsel's office under oath. So these were sort of like, as best we can get, irrefutable evidence of wrongful behavior, of not telling the truth. So the pushback now about the veracity of these things I find pretty amusing, given, as Natasha was saying, people like McGahn spoke freely because they were given permission to speak freely.
Right. All right.
It kind of substantiates, remember the anonymous letter that came out of the White House that said, "Don't worry, America, there are adults in charge." And I find that one of the overarching themes, that it kind of says that person was telling the truth.
There were some adults in the room. There were some people who weren't going to engage in the misdeeds.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.